Stephen didn't try to stand out. That was the strange part about him. In a college hostel where attention was currency, where people dressed to be seen, spoke to be heard, and competed quietly for recognition, Stephen did none of that. He didn't dress loudly. He didn't chase conversations. He didn't try to become the center of anything. And yet, somehow he always ended up there. People noticed him the way they notice soft light through a window in the morning. Natural, effortless, impossible to ignore even if you try. It wasn't loud popularity. It was something quieter, more persistent, more lasting. His name appeared in everyday conversations not as gossip or drama but as fact. Stephen helped me fix my assignment. Stephen stayed up with me before exams. Stephen already knows how to repair the hostel printer. Even the staff trusted him more than most students. If something needed fixing, checking, or calming down, Stephen was usually the first person they called without hesitation. And he never made it look like a burden. Ryan and Stephen. Ryan, his roommate, found all of it hilarious. One evening, he leaned back on his bed and looked at Stephen with mock seriousness. "You know," he said, "I think you're more popular than me here, and I'm supposed to be the main character of my own life." Stephen didn't even look up from his notebook. "That's because you keep acting like a side character." Ryan threw a pillow at him immediately. Stephen caught it without reacting much. But behind the jokes there was something real. Ryan admired him. Deeply. Even if he never said it directly. And Ryan talked about him a lot. Especially during phone calls home. Somewhere else, a quiet house. Daniel used to enjoy Ryan's calls. They were simple at first. Predictable. Say, "How are your studies? Are you eating properly? Don't waste money unnecessarily." Normal father conversations. Routine comfort. But slowly something began to change. The calls stopped being only about Ryan. They started including stories. Always the same name. Stephen. Stephen helped a guy who was about to drop out. Stephen handled a full project crisis on his own. Stephen fixed the hostel Wi-Fi like it was nothing. Daniel didn't notice when he started listening more carefully. At first it was just polite attention. Then it became curiosity. Then expectation. One evening, Daniel interrupted mid-story. "Wait," he said, "this Stephen again?" Ryan laughed immediately. "Yeah. I told you he's basically the reason half the hostel survives." Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. "That sounds like you're living with a superhero." Ryan grinned. "I'm telling you, Dad, he's not showing off or anything. He's just different." That word stayed behind after the call ended. Different. Daniel didn't know why, but it lingered in his mind longer than it should have. At first he ignored it. But curiosity doesn't stay small forever. It grows quietly. It waits until you stop noticing it. And then it becomes part of your thoughts. The photo. Weeks later, Ryan sent a group photo from campus. Nothing special. Just a casual moment after a football match. A few students standing under a cloudy sky, laughing, slightly tired, still carrying the energy of the game. Daniel opened it once. Then paused. Ryan was easy to spot. But his attention didn't stay there. It moved, almost automatically, to the boy standing slightly beside him. Stephen. He wasn't doing anything attention-grabbing. No pose. No performance. No effort to be noticed. Just standing there. Smiling naturally. Relaxed in a way that didn't feel staged. Alive in a way Daniel couldn't immediately explain. Daniel found himself staring longer than he intended. Not because he meant to, but because something about the image held his attention in place. Eventually he put the phone down. And told himself it was nothing. Just a face. Just a name from stories. Nothing more than that. But even after the screen went dark, the image stayed. That night, the weather outside began to change. Clouds thickened over the city. Wind pressed lightly against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and slow. The storm was coming. And Daniel, without understanding why, couldn't stop thinking about the boy in the photograph. Daniel didn't notice the exact moment curiosity stopped being casual. There was no clear turning point. No sudden realization. No dramatic shift. It didn't happen like a switch flipping. It happened like weather changing. Slow. Quiet. Almost invisible, until one moment you look up and realize the sky is no longer the same color it was an hour ago. At first, Stephen was just a name. Nothing more than that. Then he became a story. Then he became a pattern inside those stories. And slowly, without Daniel consciously allowing it, he became a presence in conversations that should have had nothing to do with him. And then came the part Daniel didn't notice immediately. He started waiting for it. Every time Ryan called, Daniel found himself listening a little more closely than before. Not openly. Not obviously. But internally there was a small, growing expectation. Will Stephen be mentioned today? That thought, once recognized, unsettled him. Not because Stephen had done anything wrong, but because Daniel couldn't explain why it mattered at all. And that uncertainty stayed with him longer than it should have. A different kind of silence. Daniel's house was not empty, but it felt emptier than before. Ryan being away hadn't changed the physical space, but it had changed its rhythm. Evenings stretched longer. The kitchen felt quieter. The refrigerator's low hum at night became something Daniel noticed more often than he wanted to. Life became slower in a way that made thoughts louder. He would sit with a cup of tea and take Ryan's calls in the same routine way every time. And always, without exception, the conversation would drift back to the same person. Stephen helped me today. Stephen handled it. Stephen already knew what to do. Stephen fixed it before anyone else even tried. At some point, Daniel stopped reacting outwardly. He stopped asking follow-up questions. But internally something changed. He started absorbing the name instead of hearing it. Like background noise that slowly becomes part of the mind itself. Something you don't consciously register anymore, but also can't fully ignore. The question that slipped out. One evening, after a long pause in the conversation, Daniel spoke without fully planning to. Do you talk about anyone else there? There was a brief silence on the line. Then Ryan laughed. What do you mean? I mean, other friends. Your life isn't just one person, right? Oh, Ryan said, still amused. Of course I have other friends. But Stephen's just different. There it was again. That word. Different. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning back in his chair. How different? Ryan paused this time. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was clearly trying to find a way to explain something that didn't feel like it needed explaining. He just handles everything, Ryan said finally. Like, if something goes wrong, he fixes it. If someone's stressed, he calms them down. He doesn't make things complicated. Daniel listened quietly. Ryan continued. You'll understand if you ever meet him. That sentence stayed behind after the call ended. Long after the phone was placed down. Long after the room became silent again. It stayed. And it repeated itself in Daniel's mind in ways he didn't expect. The decision he didn't fully understand. It didn't begin as a serious thought. It began as something small. Almost careless. Maybe I should visit. He told himself immediately it wasn't important. Not meaningful. Just a passing idea. And then he assigned it logic. For Ryan. Just to check on Ryan. That became the official reason in his mind. The acceptable reason. The safe reason. But even as he repeated it to himself, something inside him resisted the simplicity of it. Because deep down he knew it wasn't only about that. And that awareness made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't define. The weather changes. That night, Daniel checked the weather without really knowing why. Heavy storms were predicted. Dark clouds already forming over the region. The kind of weather that makes everything feel slightly heavier than usual. He stood by the window for a while, watching the sky slowly shift. There was no urgency in his decision. No pressure. No external force. And yet he felt restless. Like something unspoken was pulling him forward without offering a reason. As if the world itself had already decided something before he had. Eventually he took his keys, put on his jacket, and convinced himself, fully, deliberately, that this was normal. A father visiting his son. A simple trip. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nothing to question. Nothing to overthink. Just a visit. And as he stepped out into the slowly darkening evening, Daniel did not realize that he had already started moving toward something he could no longer name clearly. Something that had been building quietly for far longer than he understood. The storm didn't feel like weather anymore. It felt like pressure building in the air itself. Something heavy enough that even silence seemed unstable. Daniel kept driving anyway. The windshield wipers moved too fast to be useful, dragging rain across glass that refused to clear. Streetlights blurred into long streaks of gold and white, bending and dissolving into the darkness like they didn't belong to anything solid anymore. His grip on the wheel tightened without him noticing. This is stupid, he muttered under his breath again. But his foot didn't leave the accelerator. Because turning back would have meant sitting alone with the question he didn't want to name. Why am I really going there? The answer kept slipping away every time he tried to catch it. Ryan. That was the safe answer. The acceptable answer. A father checking on his son during a storm. Simple. Plain. But even as he repeated it in his mind, it felt incomplete. There was something else sitting beneath it. Quiet. Unwanted. Unclear. Stephen. Just the name alone changed the texture of his thoughts in a way he didn't understand yet. Not interest. Not logic. Something in between awareness and curiosity, still too undefined to call anything real. The hostel appeared suddenly through the rain, like it had been pulled out of the storm rather than built inside it. Warm yellow lights glowed through the fogged glass entrance. The building looked almost unreal compared to the violent weather outside, like a different world had been cut out and placed here on purpose. Daniel slowed the car, parked, and sat there for a second. Rain hammered the windshield so loudly it almost felt like warning. You should wait. You should turn around. You should not be here. But he opened the door anyway. The moment he stepped out, the storm took him. Cold water hit instantly, soaking through fabric within seconds. Wind pushed against him hard enough that walking felt like resistance training. He lowered his head and ran. Each step toward the hostel entrance felt longer than it should have, like distance itself was stretching. By the time he reached the door, his breath was uneven and his body already felt heavier than it had before he left the car. Inside, everything changed at once. Warm air replaced freezing wind. Noise replaced the roar of rain. Light replaced darkness. And yet, Daniel still felt slightly out of place, like he had crossed into somewhere he wasn't fully meant to be. Students moved through the corridor in groups, laughing about small things, completely unaffected by the storm outside. Their world continued normally while his felt slightly detached from reality. He stood still for a moment, trying to orient himself. That was when someone noticed him. "Sir?" The voice cut through the background noise cleanly. Not loud. Not startled. Just calm. Daniel turned. A young man was already walking toward him. Steady pace. Controlled movement. No panic, no hesitation. Stephen. Though Daniel didn't know the name yet, something about him registered immediately. Not appearance alone, but presence. The way he didn't rush even in an unexpected situation. The way he seemed already aware of what needed to be done before anything was explained. "You're completely soaked," Stephen said simply when he reached him. Daniel tried to answer normally. "I'm fine. I just came to see my son Ryan." But his voice didn't come out as steady as he wanted. A wave of fatigue hit him unexpectedly, like his body had been holding itself together purely on willpower and had just stopped. His vision shifted slightly. Not dramatic. Just enough. Stephen stepped closer immediately. "Hey, sit," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was calm instruction. And Daniel, without fully realizing it, obeyed. Stephen guided him toward a nearby chair near reception. Someone handed over a towel, but Stephen took it first and placed it around Daniel's shoulders himself. No hesitation. No awkwardness. Just action. "Did you drive in this weather?" Stephen asked. "Yes," Daniel replied, still trying to steady his breathing. Stephen exhaled lightly. That wasn't smart. A faint, tired laugh escaped Daniel. "I've been told worse things." Stephen didn't smile immediately. Instead, he reached forward and placed the back of his hand briefly on Daniel's forehead. A short pause. Then his expression shifted slightly. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," Daniel said automatically. Stephen looked at him directly. That's what people always say right before they're not fine. There was no judgment in his tone. Only certainty. And attention. That was the first thing Daniel registered clearly. This boy didn't just look at people. He noticed them. Completely. Within half an hour, Daniel's condition worsened. The cold that had soaked into him outside had already started settling deeper than he realized. His body reacted slowly at first, then all at once. Shivering. Heat rising. Head heavy. Thoughts becoming harder to organize. Stephen didn't leave. He stayed. Moving between staff and reception. Speaking briefly. Asking for a room. Bringing water. Checking Daniel again without being asked. At one point, Daniel tried to stand. Stephen stopped him gently but firmly. "Don't." "I'm okay," Daniel insisted, though the words felt weaker now. Stephen exhaled through his nose. "You say that a lot." The comment wasn't mocking. Just observation. And somehow that made Daniel stop arguing. Eventually they moved him upstairs. A spare room. Simple. Quiet. Meant for temporary use. Each step felt heavier than the last, like his body was finally admitting defeat. Stephen walked beside him the entire way. Not touching unless necessary. But always there. A steady presence just within reach. When Daniel finally lay down, the room felt distant again. The ceiling too far away. The sounds of the hostel softened into a low blur. Rain tapped against the window in steady rhythm. Stephen stood near the door for a moment, checking his phone. His expression changed slightly. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. Daniel turned his head slightly. "What is it?" Stephen hesitated, then said, "I need to step out for a while. Family emergency." Daniel tried to sit up. "No, don't go because of me." Stephen shook his head immediately. "It's not because of you." Pause. Then softer. "But I'll make sure you're okay before I leave." And he did. He adjusted the blanket. Left water within reach. Spoke briefly to staff outside. Checked once more before finally stepping toward the door. Daniel spoke without thinking. "Why are you doing all this?" Stephen stopped. Turned back. For a moment, everything outside the room felt distant again. Only rain remained in the background. Stephen looked at him calmly. "Because you needed help." No extra explanation. No emotional framing. Just fact. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. And Daniel lay there in the quiet, realizing something he couldn't properly define yet. This wasn't just help. And the boy who had given it wasn't just another student in a hostel. Something had started here. Even if neither of them knew it yet. The first morning after the fever broke, Daniel woke up slowly, like his body was climbing back from somewhere distant and heavy. For a few seconds he didn't recognize anything. The ceiling felt unfamiliar. The room was too quiet. Even the rain tapping against the window sounded like it belonged to a different life entirely. Then memory returned in fragments. The storm. The hostel entrance. The boy who had helped him. Stephen. That name settled in his mind with an unexpected weight, like it had been waiting there all along without permission. A knock came at the door. Soft. Controlled. Familiar now in a way Daniel didn't yet have words for. Before he could respond, the door opened. Stephen stepped inside. Same calm posture. Same steady expression. Same quiet confidence in how he moved, as if the space already adjusted itself around him. "You're awake," Stephen said. Daniel nodded slowly. "How long was I out?" "Not fully out," Stephen corrected. "Just fever and exhaustion. You slept most of the night." He placed a small tray on the side table. Light food. Medicine. Simple things arranged neatly without unnecessary effort. Daniel watched him. "You didn't leave?" he asked. Stephen paused briefly as if the question didn't require much thought but still deserved one. "No," he said. "I said I'd make sure you were okay. That was it. No explanation beyond that. No emphasis. Just fact. And somehow that made it feel more solid than any reassurance could have. At first the day moved in small, simple exchanges. "How are you feeling?" "Better." "Did you take the medicine?" "Yes." Nothing more than what was needed. But the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Sure. Like it wasn't waiting to be filled anymore. Just existing. Stephen stayed in the room longer than necessary after checking on him. Sometimes he sat near the window. Sometimes he checked his phone. Sometimes he just remained still as if being there itself was enough. Daniel noticed things without trying to. The way Stephen didn't seem restless. The way he didn't rush to fill silence. The way he seemed entirely comfortable in stillness. It wasn't something Daniel was used to, and that made it noticeable. By the second day, Daniel could sit up properly without the room tilting. Stephen entered again in the morning. "You look less like a disaster today," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That your version of encouragement?" Stephen gave a faint shrug. "It's accurate." A small laugh escaped Daniel before he could stop it. "You're very direct." Stephen nodded slightly. "I don't see the point in pretending." That line stayed longer than expected. Because Daniel realized how much of his own life had been built on pretending things were simpler than they were. That afternoon, the rain returned heavier again. Stephen was sitting near the window watching it fall without expression. Daniel observed him for a moment before speaking. "You're always near windows." Stephen glanced over. "I like rain," he said. "Why?" He thought for a moment. "Because it doesn't ask anything from you. It just happens." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's an unusual way to see it." Stephen tilted his head slightly. "What's yours?" Daniel hesitated. Then admitted honestly. "I usually just see it as an inconvenience." Stephen's mouth curved slightly. "That sounds like you've had a lot of inconveniences in your life." Daniel paused. Not offended. Just caught off guard by how accurately it landed. Then he let out a quiet breath of laughter. Something like that. For the first time, the conversation didn't feel like caretaker and patient. Felt like two people speaking. By the third day, Stephen stayed longer than before. Not because he had to, but because he didn't leave immediately. They talked more. About ordinary things. Or studies. Life choices. Small fragments of themselves that didn't feel important individually, but slowly began forming something else when placed together. A familiarity that didn't make sense for how little time had passed. At one point, Daniel noticed Stephen rubbing his fingers together absent-mindedly. "You do that a lot," Daniel said. Stephen looked down briefly. "Habit." "Why?" Stephen shrugged. "Helps me think." Daniel nodded. "About what?" Pause. "Longer than the previous ones." Then Stephen said quietly, "Things I usually don't think about when I'm busy." That answer felt more personal than it should have. Silence followed. Not awkward. Just thoughtful. Like both of them had stepped slightly closer to something neither was naming yet. By the fourth day the atmosphere had shifted again, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Stephen brought food as usual. But instead of leaving immediately after, he sat on the edge of the bed. Closer than before. Not deliberately. Just naturally, as if distance had stopped being something he actively maintained. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. Stephen glanced at him briefly. "You recover slowly," he said. "I'm not used to being sick," Daniel replied. "That's obvious," Stephen said lightly. Daniel smiled faintly. "You always talk like you know everything." Stephen shook his head. "I don't. I just pay attention." That word lingered. Attention. Daniel found himself noticing Stephen more after that. Not because he tried to. Because it happened on its own. By the fifth day something subtle had changed again. Stephen didn't leave immediately after checking on him. He stayed. Longer. Silence between them began to stretch differently now. Not like absence. Like presence that didn't require filling. Rain returned lightly in the evening. Stephen stood by the window again. Daniel spoke without fully thinking. "You ever feel like you're stuck somewhere?" Stephen didn't answer immediately. Then said quietly, "Sometimes." Pause. Then softer. "But I think I'm learning not everything that feels like staying is actually staying." Daniel looked at him for a moment. Not fully understanding. But feeling for the first time that something between them was starting to shift into a direction neither of them had chosen. But neither of them was resisting either. By the sixth day, Daniel no longer measured time in hours. He measured it in Stephen's visits. Morning. Afternoon. Evening. Each one arrived with the same quiet rhythm. Soft knock, the door opening, Stephen stepping inside like the room had already made space for him. And somewhere along the way Daniel stopped questioning that feeling. It simply felt normal now. Too normal to question. That morning Stephen didn't bring the usual tray right away. Instead, he stood near the door a moment longer than usual, as if checking something in his mind before speaking. "You're sitting up properly now," he said. Daniel shifted slightly on the bed. "Finally." Stephen leaned lightly against the wall. "That means I don't have to treat you like you're fragile anymore." Daniel gave him a sideways look. "You were treating me like I was fragile?" A brief pause. Then Stephen gave a small, honest shrug. "Maybe a little." That made Daniel let out a short laugh. "I've survived worse than a fever, you know." Stephen looked at him for a second longer than necessary. Then said quietly, "I believe that." There was nothing dramatic in the way he said it. No emphasis. No doubt. Just certainty. And somehow that made it harder to dismiss. Silence between them had started to change shape. It no longer felt like emptiness waiting to be filled. It felt like something already shared. Stephen didn't rush to break it anymore. Neither did Daniel. Sometimes Stephen sat on the chair near the bed. Sometimes on the floor, leaning against the wall. Sometimes by the window watching the rain when it came. But always close enough that distance stopped feeling like something important. One afternoon the rain returned again. Not heavy. Just steady. Stephen stood by the window watching it fall without moving. Daniel observed him for a while before speaking. "You like being here?" he said. Stephen didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "I didn't think I would." That caught Daniel slightly off guard. "Why?" Stephen hesitated. Then said honestly, "Because I thought I'd feel like I was intruding." Daniel frowned a little. "You're not intruding." Stephen glanced at him briefly. "I know." Pause. Then softer. "Now." That single word lingered longer than it should have. Later that evening Stephen stayed longer than usual. Daniel noticed it but didn't comment. Instead he asked, "Do you always stay this long with patients?" Stephen looked at him. "No." The answer came too quickly. Daniel noticed that immediately. Then why me? For the first time, Stephen didn't respond right away. His gaze dropped slightly as if the answer was somewhere he hadn't fully organized yet. Then he said quietly, "I don't know." But it didn't sound uncertain. It sounded like something true that he hadn't yet learned how to explain. That night the room felt different. Not smaller physically, but quieter in a more noticeable way. Stephen sat closer than before. Not touching. Not crossing anything visible. But near enough that Daniel became aware of small details he hadn't noticed earlier. The way Stephen's breathing slowed when he was thinking. The way he shifted slightly when silence stretched. The way his eyes avoided staying in one place for too long. Daniel found himself speaking more softly without meaning to. "You don't talk about yourself much." Stephen gave a faint, almost absent smile. "There isn't much to say." Daniel didn't accept that immediately. "There's always something." Stephen looked at him then, longer than usual, and said quietly, "Not everything feels easy to say." That changed the atmosphere. Not abruptly, but enough that both of them felt it. A heavier silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just more aware. Rain tapped lightly against the glass again. Stephen didn't move from his seat. Daniel didn't ask him to leave. Instead he said, "You seem tired sometimes." Stephen blinked slowly. "I am." Pause. Then Daniel asked, "Of what?" Stephen looked down for a moment, then answered softly, "Of being expected to be fine all the time." The sentence stayed in the air. Heavy. Unfolded. Undeniable. Daniel didn't respond immediately, because it didn't feel like something casual. It felt like something Stephen rarely allowed himself to say out loud. Maybe never. After that, neither of them spoke for a while. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt full. Not of words, but of awareness. Stephen stayed seated. Daniel stayed still. The distance between them didn't close. But it didn't widen either. And somehow that balance felt new. Later, as night settled in, Stephen stood near the door longer than usual. "You should sleep properly tonight," he said. Daniel nodded. "Only if you do the same." A faint smile crossed Stephen's face. "I'll try." He left. The door closed softly. But the room didn't feel empty afterward. It felt altered. Like something invisible had settled into it and refused to leave. Daniel lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling, realizing, without wanting to fully admit it, that something in his attention had shifted. Stephen wasn't just the person helping him recover anymore. He was becoming something harder to define. Something Daniel found himself noticing even when he didn't try to. And that realization made sleep feel further away than the fever ever had. The night felt unusually still. Not peaceful, just paused, like the world had stopped moving for a moment and forgotten how to start again. Daniel noticed it the moment Stephen entered the room. He didn't bring food. He didn't check medicine. He just stood there for a second longer than usual, as if he was deciding whether he should even be there at all. That alone made Daniel sit up slightly. "You didn't knock properly," Daniel said. Stephen gave a faint, distracted look. "I did. You just didn't hear it." Daniel frowned a little. That didn't sound like him. Stephen was usually precise, predictable, controlled in the smallest actions. Knock, enter, speak, leave. Tonight, none of that rhythm existed. He stepped in and closed the door behind him, but didn't sit down immediately. He stayed standing near the bed, closer than usual. Close enough that Daniel felt it without needing to look directly. Something breaking quietly. "You're not leaving early today," Daniel observed. Stephen didn't answer right away. For a moment he just stood there as if listening to something inside his own thoughts. Then he said, "I was thinking about leaving." That made Daniel pause. "Now?" Stephen shook his head slightly. "No, not like that." A silence followed. Heavier than the earlier ones. Not empty, compressed. Like the air itself had tightened around the space between them. Daniel studied him more carefully now. "Something wrong?" he asked. Stephen exhaled slowly. "I don't know." That answer felt unfamiliar coming from him. Stephen usually had an answer, even when he didn't. Tonight he didn't even pretend. The truth started slipping out. Stephen finally sat down, but not far. Near the edge of the bed. Close enough that the distance felt more symbolic than real. "I kept telling myself this was temporary," he said quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. "It is temporary." Stephen looked at him then. "Is it?" That question didn't sound like an argument. It sounded like something he had been avoiding for too long. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because something in him resisted giving a simple answer. Stephen continued, "When you got better, I thought I'd go back to normal. Just leave. Forget everything. His voice lowered slightly. But I didn't. Pause. I stayed longer than I should have. Daniel's expression shifted subtly. Why? Stephen hesitated. Longer this time. Not searching for words, but for permission to say them. Then finally. Because it didn't feel like I was supposed to leave. Silence. The air between them changed again, denser now, more aware of itself. Not uncomfortable. Just charged. The shift. Daniel sat up more fully. Stephen? Stephen looked at him. And for the first time the calm structure around him wasn't fully there. Just something exposed underneath it. Something real. I think about you, Stephen admitted quietly. Daniel didn't move. Not because he was frozen. But because the words didn't shock him. They confirmed something that had already been forming in silence for days. Stephen continued, softer now. Not in a way I planned. Pause. I didn't plan any of this. Daniel's voice dropped slightly. Neither did I. That line didn't resolve anything. But it acknowledged everything. The line that can't be taken back. Stephen let out a slow breath. This is a bad idea, he said quietly. Daniel gave a faint, tired exhale. I know. Another pause. Then Stephen added. But I can't seem to stop it. That was the moment the last layer of pretending disappeared. No more careful distance disguised as routine. No more silence acting as neutrality. Daniel looked at him for a long time. Not searching for answers. Just recognizing what was already there. Then he said softly. Neither can I. Silence followed. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding neither of them had named, but both had already reached. The moment it changes. Stephen didn't move away. Neither did Daniel. The space between them didn't collapse suddenly. It thinned slowly as if even distance had grown tired of holding itself in place. Stephen looked down briefly. Then back up. And in that quiet, unspoken agreement, Daniel reached out. Not quickly, not decisively, but carefully, like he was testing whether the moment would allow it. Stephen didn't stop him. What followed wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything that needed to be spoken over. It was just the natural end of something that had already been changing for days without permission. They stayed close for a long moment afterward. Neither stepping back. Neither speaking. Because anything said would have been either too much. Or not enough. After silence. Eventually Stephen exhaled slowly. This changes everything, he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. It already had. Stephen gave a faint, uncertain smile. Then we're late to realizing it. Daniel almost returned it. Maybe. Outside rain began again, soft, steady, unthreatening. Like the world was pretending it hadn't noticed what had just shifted inside a small hostel room. And inside it, neither of them moved away from what had already begun. Not yet. Not fully. Not anymore. Morning arrived without warning. No dramatic sunrise. No emotional resolution. Just the usual hostel sounds slipping through the walls. Distant footsteps, doors opening and closing, someone laughing in the corridor as if nothing in the world had shifted overnight. But inside Daniel's room, everything had. He had stayed awake longer than he should have. Not because he was thinking clearly, but because he wasn't. His thoughts didn't form into order. They circled the same moments again and again, refusing to settle into something manageable. What had happened the night before didn't feel distant or dreamlike. It felt present. Too present. Like something that had crossed a line without asking permission and then simply stayed there. Stephen wasn't there when Daniel fully woke. That absence made the room feel different in a way Daniel didn't immediately want to admit. He checked the time. Late morning. Then after a moment the door opened. Stephen stepped inside. Same posture. Same calm face. Same controlled movements. But something subtle had changed. Not in how he looked. In how carefully he was holding himself together. You're up, Stephen said. Daniel nodded. For a few seconds, neither of them said what was actually on their minds. But it was there anyway. Between them. Unspoken, unavoidable. Stephen placed a glass of water on the table. You should eat properly today, he said. Daniel watched him for a moment. You're acting normal, he said quietly. Stephen paused. Just a fraction longer than usual. Then answered. I'm trying to. That honesty landed differently. He wasn't hiding it. He also wasn't explaining it. Daniel leaned back slightly. Is it working? Stephen didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped for a second like he was checking something internal. Then, I don't know yet. Silence followed. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was cautious now. Measured. Like both of them were testing where the edges of their new reality had moved. A phone rang. The sound broke the stillness sharply. Stephen checked it. His expression shifted, small but noticeable. "Ryan," he said. Something tightened in Daniel's chest. Not panic. Not guilt in its simplest form. Something more like awareness becoming unavoidable. Stephen answered the call. Daniel couldn't hear the full conversation, but fragments reached him anyway. "I'm still at the hostel." "He's better now." "I'll explain later." Long pauses in between. Controlled responses. Careful tone. When the call ended, Stephen lowered the phone slowly. The room felt colder afterward. "He's coming back tomorrow," Stephen said. That sentence didn't need elaboration. It changed the atmosphere instantly. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Because there was nothing simple in it. Stephen sat down but not close. Not distant either. Just carefully placed in the room, as if suddenly aware of how every inch of space between them carried meaning now. "He'll notice something," Stephen said quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. "He might." Stephen looked at him directly. "Are you ready for that?" The question wasn't really about Ryan. It was about everything that had already started shifting between them. About consequences that were no longer theoretical. About something they could no longer pretend hadn't begun. Daniel answered honestly. "No." Stephen nodded once. "Neither am I." The rest of the day moved differently. Not calm. Not chaotic. Just restrained. No long conversations. No ease between silences. No unspoken comfort that had begun to form earlier in the week. Everything felt slightly controlled now. Like both of them were aware of being watched even when alone. Their interactions became smaller. Shorter. More deliberate. But underneath all of it, something remained unchanged. Awareness. It was in everything now. In how long their eyes met before looking away. In how silence felt slightly heavier than before. In how every ordinary action seemed to carry something underneath it that neither of them addressed directly. Stephen stayed out of the room more than usual that day. But when he did come in, Daniel noticed the differences immediately. The way Stephen paused before speaking. The way he kept distance without making it obvious. The way he seemed focused not on the situation itself, but on controlling his own reactions inside it. Not managing events. Managing himself. That evening, rain returned again. Light at first. Then steady. Stephen stood near the door longer than usual. "I should go check on arrangements for Ryan," he said. Daniel nodded. "Okay." But neither of them moved right away. Stephen looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then said quietly, "Last night shouldn't have happened like that." Daniel met his eyes. The room held still. A long pause followed. Then Daniel replied, "But it did." Stephen didn't argue. He couldn't. There was no version of events that could undo it now. So instead he gave a small, quiet nod. And left. The door closed behind him softly. The room felt emptier again. But not like before. Not like loneliness. Like consequence. Daniel stayed still for a long time. Not regretting. Not fully understanding what had shifted. Just sitting with the fact that something irreversible had already taken place, whether he was ready for it or not. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Not a storm anymore. Just an echo of one. A reminder that not everything ends cleanly. Some things simply move on. And inside Daniel, one truth settled in slowly without resistance. Whatever existed between him and Stephen before this point, could not return to what it had been. Not after this. Not anymore. The storm was never something Daniel could clearly name as a beginning. There was no single moment he could point to and say this is where it all changed. Only later did he understand that it had already begun quietly, inside a small hostel room, with rain pressing against the windows and silence stretching between two people who didn't yet know what they were becoming to each other. Time moved forward anyway. It never paused for understanding. It never waited for them to catch up. Ryan returned the next day. Everything shifted the moment he stepped back into the hostel corridor. Luggage rolling over tiled floors, familiar voices returning, ordinary life slipping back into place as if nothing had ever gone wrong. It felt like the world was trying to correct itself. Stephen met him first. Their conversation was brief, restrained, and careful. Nothing was said openly, yet everything was present in the pauses, in what was avoided rather than spoken. It was the kind of exchange that stays incomplete on purpose, because completing it would have meant acknowledging too much. Daniel stayed in the room during most of it. Not out of avoidance, but because stepping out felt like crossing into something that had already become too complicated to name. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no breaking point, no sudden exposure of truth. But Ryan noticed. He always noticed more than he said. Something about Stephen's stillness felt different to him. Something in Daniel's silence didn't align with the version of reality he carried in his mind. Still, nothing was addressed. Because some truths don't begin as words. They begin as distance. Daniel left the hostel a few days later. Not because anything had been resolved, but because staying felt like trying to hold time and place inside a space that no longer belonged to him in the same way. Stephen did not stop him. Not because he didn't care, but because neither of them understood what stopping would even mean anymore. There were no promises, no declarations, only an unspoken awareness that whatever had begun between them no longer belonged to the hostel, or the storm, or that single week of illness. It had already moved beyond all of that. Even if neither of them fully understood where it was going. The months that followed were uneven. Some days felt ordinary enough for Daniel to believe briefly that nothing had changed. But other days, the smallest things would bring everything back without warning. A sound of rain, a pause in conversation, a silence that lingered too long. Stephen and Daniel didn't speak often at first. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because too much had happened to fit easily into words. When they did speak, it was careful, measured, honest in fragments rather than explanations. And slowly something began to form again. Not because of proximity, not because of circumstance, but because of choice. Ryan took longer to accept what had shifted. Not just out of anger but confusion. The image he had of his father no longer fit neatly into the reality unfolding in front of him. And Stephen, his friend, his roommate, no longer fit comfortably into the life he thought he understood. But time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. It did not erase what he felt, but it created space around it. Space where understanding could slowly take shape. A year later, Daniel found himself in a place that felt neither like a beginning nor an ending. Only continuation. Stephen was there too. Not as a memory. Not as something distant or uncertain. But as something real, steady, and no longer bound to the storm that had once brought them together. They rarely spoke about the hostel anymore. Or the fever. Or the night everything shifted without warning. Those moments still existed, but they no longer defined them. What defined them now was quieter. More stable. Built from what remained after everything else had passed. One evening, as rain began again, soft, familiar, almost gentle, Stephen stood by the window watching it for a long time. Daniel noticed that he still did that. Not as escape. Not as longing. But simply as presence. As if he had learned how to exist inside the moment without needing to explain it. "You still like rain," Daniel said after a while. Stephen didn't turn right away. "I think I always did," he said quietly. Pause. Then softer. "I just understand it differently now." Daniel didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. Some things no longer required explanation. Later that night, when everything had quieted, Daniel stood by the same window watching the rain with him. It no longer felt like the storm. It no longer felt like something that had taken anything away. If anything, it felt like something that had arrived, stayed too long, and left behind a changed version of everything it touched. Not perfect, not simple, but real. And when Stephen eventually came to stand beside him, close but not too close, Daniel understood something he hadn't been able to understand before. Not every storm destroys. Some storms rearrange you. Quietly. Irreversibly. And then leave you with a choice. To decide what kind of life you build from what remains. Outside, the rain continued softly. Inside, nothing needed to be said. And for the first time in a long while, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like home.